esteem. When we talk about trauma responses, most people immediately think of fight or flight. Some people are familiar with freeze, esteem. But there's a fourth response that doesn't get nearly enough attention, and that's the fawn response, esteem. And if we're going to have a meaningful conversation about whether narcissistic people can fawn, we first have to really understand what fawning actually is, esteem. The fawn response is not about being nice. It's not about being agreeable. It's not about being accommodating because you're thoughtful or kind. Fawning is a survival strategy, esteem. It develops in environments where someone learns, often very early in life, that the safest way to exist is to keep other people happy, esteem. It's the child who senses a parent's volatility and becomes hyper-attuned to their moods. It's the partner who walks on eggshells, anticipating every need, smoothing over every tension, esteem, apologizing before they've even done anything wrong. Fawning is rooted in fear. It is the nervous system's calculation that says, if I can keep you pleased, maybe you won't hurt me, esteem. If I can shrink myself, maybe I'll stay safe. And over time, this becomes automatic. It's not strategic. It's not manipulative. It's reflexive, esteem. The person may not even realize they're doing it. Their body has learned that appeasement equals survival. In trauma psychology, we understand that these responses are adaptive, esteem. They help someone get through something overwhelming. But in adulthood, the fawn response can become deeply self-erasing. The person over-accommodates. They abandon their own needs, esteem. They tolerate behavior that harms them because conflict feels more dangerous than self-sacrifice. So when we talk about fawning, we're talking about a pattern that emerges from vulnerability, esteem, not dominance. We're talking about someone who feels less powerful, not more. That distinction matters, esteem, because if we confuse strategic charm or calculated compliance with trauma-based appeasement, we misunderstand both trauma and narcissism. The fawn response is not about control, esteem. It is about safety, and that difference changes everything. Now that we understand what the fawn response truly is, fear-based, self-protective, rooted in survival, esteem, we have to turn our attention to narcissism itself. Because if we're going to ask whether narcissistic people can fawn, we have to be very clear about how narcissism is structured, esteem. At its core, narcissism is organized around a fragile sense of self. On the surface, you see confidence, entitlement, certainty, sometimes even grandiosity, esteem. You see someone who appears self-assured, maybe even superior, but underneath that is something much more unstable. Narcissism is not the same thing as healthy self-esteem. Healthy self-esteem is flexible. It can tolerate feedback. It doesn't collapse under criticism. Narcissism, by contrast, is rigid. It depends on external validation to stay intact, esteem. This is why narcissistic individuals seek admiration, attention, and affirmation so relentlessly. It's not just preference, it's regulation, esteem. Their emotional equilibrium depends on being seen as special, powerful, exceptional. When that image is threatened, we often see defensiveness, rage, blame, shifting, or devaluation, esteem. The system is designed to protect the ego at all costs. Another essential feature here is empathy impairment. Not always a total absence of empathy, esteem, but a limited or inconsistent capacity to truly center another person's emotional experience. Relationships become transactional. Other people become sources of validation, status, or supply, esteem. That doesn't mean narcissistic individuals never feel pain or insecurity. They absolutely do, esteem. But their coping mechanisms are organized around protecting the self-image rather than preserving mutual connection. And this is where the distinction becomes important, esteem. The narcissistic structure is built to maintain control, superiority, and image. Even when insecurity is present, the behavioral response is often to reassert dominance or reclaim admiration, esteem. That's very different from the fawn response, which is built around reducing threat by becoming smaller, quieter, more accommodating. Narcissism says, I must not be diminished. Fawning says, esteem, I must not be hurt. Those are two very different nervous system agendas. And if we don't understand that foundational structure, esteem, we'll misinterpret what we're seeing when narcissistic behavior looks soft, compliant, or even submissive. Because in narcissism, the driving force is rarely safety through surrender, esteem, it's stability through control, and that distinction is where the real clarity begins. So now we arrive at the real question, can a narcissistic person actually have a fawn response, esteem? And this is where things get nuanced. Because on the surface, you might see behavior that looks like fawning, you might see flattery, you might see sudden agreeableness, esteem. You might even see what appears to be submission. But we have to look at the motivation underneath the behavior. True fawning is fear-driven and automatic, esteem. It comes from a nervous system that believes it is not safe. It's not calculated, it's not strategic, it's not about gaining advantage, it's about minimizing harm, esteem. The person fawning often feels smaller, overwhelmed, and desperate to prevent escalation, When a narcissistic individual becomes excessively complimentary or compliant, esteem, the internal engine, is usually different. It's often strategic. It's impression management. It's positioning. It may be about securing admiration, gaining access to something they want, esteem, or aligning themselves with someone who enhances their status. The behavior may look soft, but the agenda is often self-protective in a very different way, esteem. It's about maintaining image or control. Now, can a narcissistic person ever feel fear? Of course. Can they feel threatened? Absolutely. Esteem. And in moments where they encounter someone with more power, more authority, or greater status, you may see a shift. But even then, esteem. What looks like appeasement is often hierarchy, sensitive behavior. It's not "I am unsafe and must shrink." It's more, "I must align upward to protect my position." Esteem. This is why it's so important not to confuse charm with trauma. Narcissistic charm can be intense, even overwhelming. It can feel like adoration. But charm is often a tool. Esteem. Fawning is a reflex. Charms, "Let me win you." Fawning says, "Please don't hurt me." And that distinction protects you from misinterpreting manipulation as vulnerability. Esteem. Because when we mistake calculated compliance for trauma-based appeasement, we risk overextending empathy where boundaries are actually needed. Behavior alone doesn't tell the story. Esteem. Motivation does. And if we don't look beneath the surface, we will continue to confuse strategy with survival. Esteem. One of the biggest areas of confusion comes from what I often call the charm offensive. Because when a narcissistic person turns on the warmth, the flattery, the attentiveness, esteem, it can look remarkably similar to fawning. They may compliment you constantly. They may agree with everything you say. They may appear fascinated, supportive, esteem, even self-effacing for a period of time. And if you've learned about trauma responses, you might think, is this fawning? Are they feeling unsafe? Esteem. But the charm offensive is typically not about safety. It's about acquisition. It's about influence. It's about drawing someone in, securing admiration, esteem, or establishing control early in a dynamic. This is where we often see love bombing, intense praise, rapid intimacy, promises of a future that feels almost cinematic. Esteem. The energy can be intoxicating. It feels attentive. It feels affirming. It can even feel healing if you've been deprived of validation in the past. Esteem. The difference lies in what happens when the dynamic shifts. A trauma-based fawn response doesn't suddenly flip into devaluation when it no longer works. Esteem, it doesn't withdraw warmth as punishment. But the narcissistic charm offensive often has an expiration date. Once admiration is secured, once attachment is formed, esteem, or once control feels stable, the excessive agreeableness fades. And in its place, you may see criticism, entitlement, or emotional distance. Another key difference is intentionality. Esteem. The person engaging in a charm offensive is often highly aware of how they are being perceived. There is an element of performance. They are curating an image. Fawning, by contrast, esteem, is not curated. It's reactive, it's anxious, it's driven by the hope of preventing harm, not gaining leverage. And this is why the confusion can be so destabilizing. Esteem. Because when someone's early attentiveness disappears, you may assume you did something wrong. You may try harder. You may start fawning yourself. Esteem. And that's where these patterns can lock together in very painful ways. So when you see extreme charm, don't just look at the sweetness. Look at the sustainability. Esteem. Look at whether the behavior is consistent when there's no benefit attached. Because genuine safety seeking looks very different from strategic seduction. Esteem. Charm that is conditional is not vulnerability. It's leverage. Another place this becomes especially confusing is when narcissistic individuals appear submissive. Esteem. You might see them defer to a boss, praise a high-status colleague, or become unusually agreeable around someone with more power. And it can look like humility. Esteem, it can even look like insecurity. But again, we have to examine the structure underneath the behavior. Narcissism is deeply sensitive to hierarchy. Esteem. Many narcissistic individuals are exquisitely attuned to status, who has it, who doesn't, and where they stand in that structure. When they encounter someone who outranks them in authority, esteem, wealth, influence, or social capital, you may see a noticeable shift. They may flatter upward. They may align themselves closely with that person. Esteem. They may suppress open hostility or criticism in those spaces. But this isn't the same thing as trauma-based fawning. It's not about feeling small and trying to stay safe from emotional harm. Esteem. It's about self-preservation within a power structure. It's strategic positioning. Aligning upward can protect their image. It can grant access. It can enhance their status by association. Esteem. It's less, "Please don't hurt me," and more, "How do I benefit from this proximity?" What's particularly telling is how the behavior changes depending on who's in the room. Esteem. The same person who is deferential to someone above them may be dismissive, condescending, or even cruel to someone they perceive as lower in status. That up-down dynamic is critical. Esteem, trauma-based fawning tends to show up across contexts when someone feels unsafe. Narcissistic hierarchy sensitivity shows up selectively, upward compliance, downward dominance, esteem, and this selective submission can be very disorienting if you're on the receiving end of the harsher side. You may wonder, esteem, why are they so kind to them but so critical of me? The answer often lies in perceived power. Narcissism organizes itself around protecting and elevating the self-image, esteem. It scans constantly for advantage. So when you see apparent submissiveness, ask yourself, is this about fear and safety, or is this about status and strategy, esteem? Because those are very different motivations, and they produce very different relational outcomes. Submission that shifts with power is not vulnerability. It's calculation, esteem. So why does this distinction matter so much? Because confusion is where people get stuck. When you misinterpret narcissistic charm, submission, esteem, or agreeableness as a trauma-based fawn response, you may extend empathy in ways that cost you deeply. You may think, they're just scared, they're wounded. If I love them better, esteem, they'll feel safe. And that belief can keep you in cycles that erode your own well-being. Understanding the difference protects you. If someone is truly operating from a fawn response, esteem, the work is about safety, boundaries, and healing trauma. It's about helping that person feel secure enough to have a voice. But if someone's behavior is strategic, esteem, if it's about image management, control, or status, then the intervention is different. The response is boundaries, clarity, and not being pulled into performance, esteem. This clarity also helps you check yourself. Because many people who find themselves in relationships with narcissistic individuals have strong fawn tendencies of their own. Esteem, they smooth things over, they over-explain, they apologize to keep the peace. And when they encounter narcissistic charm or selective submission, esteem, it can activate that caretaking instinct even more. You may start managing their moods, protecting their ego, or excusing their behavior because you've misread it as vulnerability, esteem. But vulnerability is consistent. It's not turned on and off depending on the audience. It doesn't disappear when accountability enters the room, and it doesn't weaponize kindness, esteem. When you learn to distinguish survival-based appeasement from strategic compliance, you stop personalizing what was never about you. You stop chasing the early charm, esteem. You stop trying to decode every shift. Instead, you observe patterns. You ask yourself whether the behavior is mutual, stable, and respectful over time, esteem. This isn't about labeling or diagnosing everyone around you. It's about understanding relational dynamics so you can protect your emotional health. When you see clearly, esteem, you respond differently. And when you respond differently, the entire dynamic changes. Clarity is not cruelty, it's self-respect.